You're listening to Very Spatial Podcast, episode 738, May 20th, 2024. Hello and welcome to a Very Spatial Podcast. This is Frank.
This is Barb.
And Jesse and Sue are unfortunately away overseas in Japan, having a wonderful time, I'm assuming. We've seen a few pictures on Instagram, and if you follow Kinda Spatial on Instagram, you can see some of those as well. But it's a bit of a research project team that they're doing, and it's awesome. And we hopefully will be back with us next week, or the next episode, I should say, to record. In lieu of that, Barbara and I are going to give you a bit of a news episode. So first up, the Ordnance Survey has created a new national vernacular mapping tool, which is a way fancier sounding term, I think, tool, the vernacular, but it's essentially trying to get at a lot of the sort of unique names that people use for particular places and to get that into sort of a big database for the Ordnance Survey. We have GNIS within the United States, and it's got a long history, and it does have like antiquated names, but the vernacular tool is designed to do something a little different, which is include those sort of semantic similar names and kind of colloquial names that places may have. For example, they have nicknames such as Jabba the Hutt, Stink Cove, and Harry Potter Bridge, which are in there, which obviously some of them are quite new. But in the UK, in the Ordnance Survey, they have, vernacular names that go back literally centuries. So it's kind of exciting. And there's a lot of, all of our collective dissertation advisor, Dr. Harris, he did a lot of stuff with semantic names of places. So I think you'll find this kind of interesting. I'll have to send him an email or text him or something.
And this is a replacement for a mapping tool they had for about 10 years called Fintan, and this was done at the request of the Coast Guard so that Coast Guard responders could, get there in time to know which location they should be going to with greater confidence. What's really interesting to me is this includes so many different features because it's cliffs, caves, sandbanks, coastal car parks, to name a few. So, we have these nicknames for so many different places. I was going to say place names for places, which is...
Well, it's not wrong. I mean, they are talking about place names for places, but yeah, it is. There's a lot of variety out there. And, every place does it slightly different. And they have, just different nicknames for places, and knowing everyone in a particular location knows what you're talking about, but that doesn't mean everybody that comes to that location or needs to interact with that location knows what you're talking about.
And I feel like I say this all the time when the vernacular comes up, but I still remember one of my first ESRI conferences at the UC where the students from Hawaii went across the stage because they had done mapping. They'd gone out on their bikes and asked people the colloquial names for beaches for similar reasons, because the people were calling in to the emergency response and using a nickname for a beach. And so they were trying to catalog all those nicknames so you could have quicker response. So it's exciting to see a tool like this, and also really interesting to see all the colloquial names that are coming up. I hope to see a map of this at the UC. That would be fun.
My personal interaction with vernacular names actually started when I was in high school. Most of my family is from a place called Hickory, North Carolina, which is on the western part of North Carolina in the United States. And my parents, my dad grew up there, and my mom lived there for years and years and years. And my grandparents, on my mother's side, lived not too far from a place. There was a bar, and one of the ways that my parents used to talk about that bar is they would say, "Oh, you go to where Wayno's, you go to Wayno's, and you take a left." Well, Wayno's doesn't exist. It's an old name for the bar. It used to be called Wayno's, and then like many bars, it closed down and was bought out, and they changed it to something else. And I eventually got my parents to agree to used to be called Wayno's, but to them and to many of their friends in our family of that age, that's the vernacular they use for that turn, that location. And that's a very common pattern you see all over any country, any place. The vernacular becomes kind of the thing.
Another project that's going on and talking about like mapping tools is Oak Ridge National Laboratory has a team that is working with members in Ecuador to map the Coca River. They are using remote sensing and drones and geospatial because they're looking at natural disasters that can happen very quickly, and things change quickly with a river, which again we've talked about how they're moving and always changing and dynamic, so it makes mapping them difficult. And they're looking at things like sediment displacement of a lava dam collapse that occurred, landslides, and the formation of what they're calling the Ecuadorian Grand Canyon. And these impact a lot of things. They threaten homes and businesses, they impact bridges and pipelines, and they can even take out something like a hydropower plant that might impact electricity that's available. So they are bringing together this international team and experts to map the Coca River, which has previously been unstudied. It's going to be really interesting because they're going to be using high-resolution visual, thermal, and multispectral imagery to update Ecuador's national maps. And this way they're hoping to work on mitigating the erosion that's happening. It's just so many different things coming together that need to happen in order to better understand something like this. And the pictures are just gorgeous too.
Yeah. What prompted this is a waterfall that's thousands of years old just went away on February 2nd, 2020. So it's not like it just went away over time. It just, boom, was gone one day. And they were like, what's up with that? And so what ended up happening after the bit of a study is there was upstream of the lava dam, there was a sinkhole that formed in the riverbed, and it's just sort of it collapsed, and the river dropped below the lava dam, and therefore the waterfall went away. But this is the type of thing where when we talk about in the geospatial realm, no data, no geography, there's clearly a very vibrant, active, evolving geography that's going on with the Coca River. But, we don't have a lot of great information about it other than, maybe a squiggly line on a map. So this is just the deepening of our knowledge and understanding of the world around us. Just another example of it. And it's pretty cool that they can use, fairly modern technologies to do that. And next up in the news, in the American Samoa, researchers are starting to use they're doing some studies to figure out exactly the impacts of submarine groundwater discharge on the coral reefs. Apparently, it is causing a massive outbreak of, and I'm not going to get this correct, but Valonia fastigiata algae, which is, think of it like an infection for corals, and it's really starting to kill a lot of the corals and damage them terribly. And these are an important part of the ecosystem around the American Samoa oceans. So what the researchers are trying to understand is what the groundwater discharge, which is essentially human-generated discharge into the waterways, what's going on, how's that impacting it, how's it making this algae grow a lot more than it would normally as a sort of a multiplicative effect, what is happening spatially to figure out, how those impacts can have a major impact, overuse the word impact, how they can have a major influence on the growth and health of our coral areas offshore.
It's really interesting that they are looking at ways to analyze this and understand it better, because it's a component of this is understanding it, but then also being able to communicate to the public and others what the impacts are and how to mitigate them. And this is something where it's very hard to explain to people about how water systems work, especially how what they do can impact groundwater, and then how that groundwater that might not even be close to something like a river or the ocean ends up impacting something as sensitive as coral. So it's going to be really interesting to see all the methods that they're using. That includes looking at time series of electrical resistivity tomography, or they're going to be looking at the shoreline and then looking at other things like freshwater discharge. So just, again, another thing that's very multi-layered, that is using all the technology out there to get a better understanding of a growing problem.
A really interesting thing here, I think, is they're using tower-based thermal infrared to detect the groundwater sources and the plumes or diffusive sources. Now, that's interesting to me because, we're such a mobile, small m, focused world now. We're thinking about drones, which they're using drones and, UAVs and that sort of thing, and using, satellite imagery and what name you out there to connect this stuff, to use tower-based stuff to get an idea of this. And I think that's kind of neat that there is a utility for a lot of different approaches, and we should probably not lose sight of that fact, which is kind of cool.
Also, a lot of times we aren't making that connection. Going back to what I was saying too, that the corals are part of what mitigate erosion and flooding on beaches. So the USGS has opened their William T. Pecora Awards. These are presented to individuals or teams using satellite or aerial remote sensing data. So if you know anyone that's making outstanding contributions towards understanding the Earth's surface, then you have a short window to get your nomination in. They're due by June 15th. So please look to recognize individual or group that you know of that has been making great strides in this area. We cover this in the news all the time, and any of those groups could be someone that is potentially nominated.
Yeah, it's focusing on remote sensing, but that's an incredibly intricate part of what we do in the geospatial realm more broadly. So I think a little bit like GeoInt, and the fact that it can be a big umbrella. So don't be afraid to think a little outside the box, a little more cliches I can throw in there to think of nominees who are doing some really interesting stuff. So this is a little bit off the beaten path from sort of geospatial, but it's kind of interesting. The air taxi Archer Aviation is trying to get progress towards getting FAA certification. And so the idea here is that they can have really small, compared to most aerial vehicles, air taxis that will be used in, dense urban areas. Right now, the main area this is taking place is in Manhattan, which is not surprising. And they want to expand this to New York and LA, Chicago, those sort of places. But it's a very small air taxi unit that's designed to help people fly a relatively short distance as far as flights go. And they charge you so much per what they call seat mile. So they were talking about from a suburb to a city, Archer estimate that an air taxi flight would take 12 minutes and cost $3.30 per seat mile. So, it's about having the time of travel within a suburb to a city, irrespective of traffic. And if you've ever driven in New York City, you know that there's no such thing as irrespective of traffic. I think it's traffic 24/7, 365 in that city. So, and it's like that in a lot of urban areas. So this is the idea, is to get people in and out fairly quickly. It's kind of interesting, particularly since the vehicle they're using, they have a picture on the link in the show notes. This is about a year or so old. It looks a little bit like a drone in that it's got a lot of propellers that are lifting it up. And, it only holds a small number of people to do that. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting because they're looking to do this with Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Also here they talked about United Airlines and New York City and Los Angeles, and totally different topographies. So this is something that, does cross over with geospatial, I think, in both, the certifications from the FAA, the fact that we've got only so much aerospace for doing things. Like you said, it looks like a drone in many ways. I was thinking about, if you have that in that space and then you have drones in that space, potentially, how are you going to keep track of that? So it's a very interesting topic, as you said. So next up in the news, if you have seen the Aurora Borealis that was out, also the geomagnetic storms that made the news, one of the impacts from that were outages in GPS navigation systems. And one of those were for modern agriculture, which is heavily reliant on GPS. So John Deere and other brands were telling farmers to, pause using high-tech tractors that use GPS systems to program in, while this GPS noise, because farmers were reporting it was derailing it. So I thought that was really interesting that this was a large geomagnetic storm, and you're starting to see some of what the impacts could be.
Yeah, the really interesting thing here is the RTK systems they have can plant precisely to the centimeter, which I think is phenomenal. It's amazing. It's, living in the future, so to speak. And what they're essentially saying is that a little bit of GPS noise can really throw off the estimation. So even if you have sufficient GPS signal to get you, to the grocery store or whatever it may be, it can be very fuzzy because as a human, you can say, okay, I'm at my destination, even though you're off by 30 meters, 100 meters, whatever it may be. You can say, oh, yeah, okay, I see it's over there. I'm fine. I don't need this thing anymore. But when you're talking about down to the centimeter of how to plant a particular, 100 acres of farmland or whatever it may be, that can have massive impacts on your yield and yield rates if that's wrong. And it's just one of those things that I think if we went to farmers 100 years ago, it would just blow their mind to think that this is, things going on in the sun would have that much of an impact on where you stick the plant in the ground. Obviously on growing, clearly the sun has massive impact, but these flares that would change how you decide where things go in the ground. It's amazing to think of the interconnected world that we're in today.
What's exciting for me is I have a bunch of posters from NASA that talk about how GPS works that I show or give out to people when I'm working with the public. And it uses the tractor in the field and the GPS to illustrate GPS. And so this is something now that I can add to the talk explaining about the role of GPS in agriculture and understanding the earth. So again, something that a lot of times we don't think about is the how GPS has changed the world, and a big part of that is agriculture.
Yeah, it's been 10, 12 years ago now, Barbara and I took a trip across country, and it was a lot of fun. But I remember when we got out to the Midwest into, corn country, as they say, that seeing those big robotic systems that were doing the planting. And it's the thing of science fiction. I remember reading about these things in science fiction when I was a kid. And it's just a piece of modern day science fiction that, you don't think about how much of an impact these relatively formerly unimportant events can be. Next up in the news, in Finland, they're doing something that is near and dear to my heart, and it's too bad Sue's not here to engage in the conversation a bit, is they're using AR and VR tools to help with road and maritime safety. So the idea here is that it's nothing really new conceptually, which is displaying information to drivers to say, hey, you need to know this. There's a thing coming up here. There's shopping available. There's, pedestrians happening. All these sorts of technologies conceptually have been around forever and a day. And in fact, Barbara and I were lucky enough to get a new car not that long ago, and it's got some limited AR capability in it. It's got a heads-up display. It's very limited on the AR part, but to some extent, it can show you, it shows you, for example, the speed limit based upon roadsides that it can see, and it can tell you when the stop sign's coming up, all those sorts of things. The idea behind this is to get this on everybody's windscreen. And they've been working in Finland to try to do this to help bootstrap a lot of professional endeavors, professional drivers like, truck drivers or delivery trucks or things like that, where it's a challenge to get people who are well trained in that area with a lot of local knowledge necessarily, increasingly so. The real problem they're running into is the maritime industry, because they just have a massive shortage of skilled seafarers. So you have to have a lot of bootstrapping training and a lot of ways to communicate complex information to users. And this is what they've sort of settled on, which is kind of exciting.
And in similar news, just in terms of investing in the future for companies and just, logistics, Amazon's Redshift, which if you think about how immense Amazon is and all the logistics involved, their large scale data center has been using H3, which is, they've announced Hexagonal Hierarchical Geospatial Indexing System, or H3. And this is in order for them to do fast spatial lookups at scale. It was just announced, and it's pretty interesting because there are so many different ways we're trying to handle data to make all this big data out there, this big spatial data, usable. And what they're looking at is balancing the big spatial data with real-time interactivity and rendering. So I don't know much about it. I just have what I'm seeing, but we know that, hexagons are one of the ways to go in order to better handle spatial data. And they're going to be making this available now in their Amazon Redshift.
Yeah, so the basic idea here is that for the most part in the past, we've used geography or geometry to do geolocation. And it's something we're all familiar with. Latitude, longitude. We know what that is. You know, you give me enough digits and I can get you down to, a square foot or whatever it may be. But what they're pushing is the notion of a hex. And so each of these hexes, and you can think of them like cells, they really are hex cells, but they're just not, X by X cells or hex size. And each of those have a unique identifier. And I think it's said in the article, I'm trying to find it now. It's a very short ID string, but the idea is, I don't know how many digits it is, but the idea is that if I give you an ID, you can find the exact location on the planet and thereby connected all this information via that string. It's the idea is to get you into the general area that you're interested in, and then you can get into more fine granular information. Hexes are not this is nothing radically new. People have done this in the past, but it is kind of interesting they're pushing this down in the Amazon Web Services. And what's driving a lot of this, their argument for hexes, is processing time. So basically what they're saying is that if you're using traditional geometries, you might have this particular thing that they did. I'm not sure exactly what analysis they were doing, but it would take 12 days. But with spatial indexes, it takes 7 hours. You have to transfer 4 terabytes of data, and with spatial indexes and hexes, it's 1.5 terabytes. So it's the idea is to more efficiently use the cloud services that they have available by using this. And that's, pretty exciting. One data point in there they pointed out is the population coverage. With geometries, it's 15.48%. With the spatial indexes, it's also 15.48%. So the idea is that we do things quicker. It costs less data. It costs less time. It costs less energy and money and computing resources, but you don't lose any quality. That's what they're arguing. The proof is going to be in the pudding at the end of the day, but it's pretty cool that they're doing this.
Yeah, and it is, and they're using Carto Builder. But when I look at the interface that they have, all I can think of is a big strategy game like Civ or something like that. When I look at the hexes on there and the coverage, it makes me feel it's a little bit like you're, playing a game across the board on this. So.
Okay, and that's it for the news. This week we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm springing this on Barbara so she can yell at me. We're going to have a little brief conversation on a topic, and it's going to be on state conferences for GIS and things that we like and things that we think are interesting. So the West Virginia West Virginia Association of Geospatial Professionals just had its West Virginia GIS conference called West Virginia GeoCon. That is a mouthful, people. But that's what just happened about a week and a half ago or something like that, 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, Barbara and I can only go for one day because of work commitments. But we went down there and we listened to some interesting presentations and we talked to some interesting vendors. It was at the state capitol in West Virginia, Charleston, West Virginia. Typically, this conference happens every other year, and it moves between Charleston, West Virginia, and Morgantown, West Virginia for historical reasons. And Barbara and I have been involved in this conference for more years than either of us want to admit or think about. And so I wanted to take a minute to sort of reflect on what a state conference could look like or should look like, not just West Virginia, but other places.
Yeah, I feel like this is sprung on me and we're having an after meeting. But I think it is also very important because, this is something that you see more and more conferences coming up at the state level and beyond regional level. And it's one of those questions, too, that you get asked as a geospatial professional or a professional of any type to be involved with a conference. And a lot of times you need a way know what you're getting into. So in some ways, I feel like this is a discussion to also, make people aware of the time commitment that normally comes if you are involved with something like the planning or on a committee for something like this, because it is very much a year-long commitment or longer for anyone that's involved. I know about a state conference. I can't imagine a large conference like some of the events that we're going to talk about coming up. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, because of our work commitment, we didn't get to engage in some of the more social aspects of the conference. And we heard from other members that was a really exciting piece of the conference this year. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And I'm kind of wondering, what is the value of a conference, the non-conference time, or is the value of a conference the conference time? In other words, it is just about getting us all together in a room so we can talk, or do the presentations help? What do you think?
Well, I mean, again, feel like this is sprung on me, but I'll say any conference I've been involved in as a professional, that there's always that moment when you feel that you're part of the in crowd in your profession, when you're invited to those types of discussions that happen in the hallways and elsewhere during a con. That's where you make your connections, that where you make your collaborations, and you meet with people you haven't seen in a while to touch base, but also to start networking. I think there's value in both. I think you have to have both, because sometimes the only time you have to yourself for training, for professional development, to learn what's going on in your field, especially in the geospatial realm where you might be one of the only people within your company or organization who does geospatial stuff. It's your time to be with people who know who you are and what you do. Even though a lot of times at a geospatial state conference is going to be people from around a broad range of, topic areas that they focus on or they work in. So it's, to me, would be, I'm thinking, would there be space in a state? I think in some states with a larger population where you might be in a room with 100 people that are geospatial within the same field that you're in, and how amazing that would be for certain fields or industries.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you brought that. I hadn't thought about the scale up question. California's state GIS conference, if they have one, I assume they do, is going to be fundamentally different than West Virginia's state GIS conference, because just in terms of population, assuming, which is a big assumption, but assuming that the number of GIS users, professional GIS users, scales up directly with population.
What's interesting to me is that, and having worked with economic development in areas like that, how much we tend to stay within conferences in our region. So we tend to stay with our contingent states. Usually you don't see a lot of people coming from other states coming to a state conference, except for a few, although that number is growing. But aren't there, putting aside Toddler's First Law, it might be good to go to conferences that are state conferences where the state is more similar to you, or that would be any region worldwide. So it might be good to, go from West Virginia to a state in the Midwest, or even to another country where you share similar topic areas, similar issues and things like that. That's always been exciting to me when you're talking about geospatial with solid waste at an international conference, meeting people like you doing the things that you're doing, where often you don't find that within your own state just because there's not many of you.
So I'm going to jump back to the question I started with, because I didn't answer it, which is what's more valuable. I kind of feel like increasingly that it's two conferences happening simultaneously. And I think that the challenge is, how do you weave each conference experience together for you, the attendee? On the one hand, you've got these presentations that are sort of formalized depictions of work that's gone on or things that are possible. So sometimes it's a company that's essentially a sales pitch, for lack of a better term, but sometimes it's, this is the type of thing we did for our clients. And then you have people that are working, particularly in a governmental capacity, going, this is what we tried and this didn't work and this is great, and all that sort of stuff. That stuff is really valuable for learning about what you can and can't, possibilities within your industry that you could apply at home. So on the one hand, you got that going on, which is really important and very useful. And I would say, for example, the Esri UC, the most important things that I've walked away from it haven't necessarily been the Esri. And this is not a state conference, but it's a good example of this. It's been the Esri presentations. It's been the users' presentations about, Esri says it'll do X, Y, and Z, but when rubber hit the road, we found there was issues. And this is how we got around those issues. So that's incredibly valuable. But at the same time, you have to find time and ability to have those side conversations that don't make it into the 15-minute presentation, to say, we tried this, and then we did that, and then there was this pain in the neck stuff, and then we ran into a problem with that, and then the political side asked about this, all this sort of backstory stuff that doesn't necessarily make it into the presentation, that can be really informative. Or you end up with conversations that say, hey, we were looking to do this type of thing, which is a little bit like the thing you did. And then they can go, oh yeah, well, we were going to do something very similar too. Maybe we can work together, partner together to make something bigger, move this in a different direction. And I struggle even after all these years on how to balance that 2 conferences in 1 problem, because honestly, it's exhausting.
Yeah, I was thinking about this in terms of younger professionals, where a lot of times you feel that pressure where you need to attend as many things as possible that are on the agenda. But at the same time, that where you're going to get a lot of your feedback from, and sometimes even the meat of what's going to get you along in your career is in that other side of the conference, and that you might not feel comfortable in, seeking that out. So thinking about how someone who's a young professional balances that, and also how they can get their employers to recognize that as being an important part of this. It's not just about what did you attend, but it's also about what did you overall get out of the experience that might not have been included just in the sessions.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. The good notion you bring up about the young developers, the young professionals, even older professionals. The older people tend to be a little more honest about what they can and can't do, or know or don't know. The mid-year, mid-career ones, I think a little less honest about it sometimes. But it's very valuable for me to listen to a presentation. I hear, we did this, we did that. And I go, I don't know anything about any of that stuff. I'm so behind. I don't know what's going on. And then you talk to them afterwards and you realize they didn't either. They just started doing stuff and then figuring out what they could and learned as they went. And you think, oh, I can do that. So that is almost as valuable as learning what they did or the project or anything like that. So I think you're absolutely right. That's something you've got to engage with, even in any level in your career, but certainly when you're starting out.
And I think that either side of a conference, whether it be the informal side or the formal side, depends on engagement and depends on, especially at a state or, a municipal level where you're talking about not as much money and not as much sponsorship. It's going to depend on the involvement of members who are putting in their time, also reaching out to industry and organizations, nonprofits and others to get involved, people who might not think of themselves as geospatial. As always in geography, it's reaching out to the groups who might not realize, yes, we want to hear your voice, we want to know what you do, but because they're not using the exact same terminology, or they say, well, I'm using the software, but I'm not thinking of myself as a geospatial professional. Part of this is reaching out and saying, yes, you're a geospatial professional, because sometimes they're the ones that can get the most out of a conference like this, meeting people who consider themselves to be part of the geospatial community, because they might not even realize that there's that support network there.
So let's jump to another question within the topic, which is, what do you think about vendors? Vendors are an interesting conversation topic for me for a state agency, because in many cases, they can make or break financially a conference. If you're part of a professional organization or something like that just doesn't have the resources to lose money on a conference, getting sponsorships and vendors there to, they usually they pay a fee, and some of it can be quite substantial to attend there. And they're doing it because, they expect that provides an exposure or an opportunity for them to talk about their products and then maybe make, some sales and some revenue off of that. So that can be really important. But at the same time, I don't find it I'm not terribly interested in hearing sales pitches at a conference, particularly in the presentation level, which I think is a little hard to balance that at a conference. Like, how do you get vendors to say, to add to the dialogue without saying, and for $19.95, you can buy that too? I'm not sure how we balance that well.
I've actually had good experience with vendors when they, because vendors are setting up booths, they're doing this, usually professionally for their organization or their industry. It's when you're with them and they go into what they call the blood and guts of what they do, and they're talking honestly about their experiences, or they're telling you funny about something that happened. And I think that's, again, that informal side. When you see the informal side of a vendor as a geospatial professional, I think is what you get a lot out of it. But I think they need to know that you're open to that type of dialogue. So I guess what I'm saying is like you said, there's two different conferences going on in the same space. They're different places. And one is the more formal one and one is that informal one of community. And part of that is, that reaching out and allowing that to happen.
Yeah. For me, vendors I think they work best and sponsors work best when they're part of our community. And I don't mean that they don't live necessarily in the same state or anything like that, but most of them, not always, but most of them are geospatial nerds like us. And they want to talk geospatial nerd stuff too. And I think that it works better if we're all trading war stories as much as anything. And I think that there's utility knowing what vendors are capable of doing and not capable of doing and the products they provide. But also it's really nice to know that, hey, you're one of us, and whatever the money flows happen because we're talking about client or vendor, that's almost separate than the stuff we do.
And I actually do need to give I don't know if it's a shout out or so excited, but I did bring my projection cards from the Kickstarter with all the cartography and the projections on it. And they are the icebreaker that everyone said they would be. And people got excited and we looked at cards, and then people were like, where do I get these cards? And I told them about the Google Sheet where you can sign up and you can trade. And so I think that that projection cards met their purpose. And we did have the discussion of, did you crack open all your cards to see what you had? And I had to say, unfortunately, no, I'm one of those type of nerds that I only crack them open one at a time, and I'm very protective of mine.
Yeah, so, I have an unopened pack right now on my desk. I keep thinking I shouldn't open those. They'll be collectible on eBay later.
You should open them. It was a lot of fun. It was the icebreaker, and then people look at it and they talk about projections, which again, it's our community. We know things. We can talk about our experiences with stuff. And also, I'd encourage younger groups to get involved. I went and I talked about a project my students were doing, and we were talking about some of their experiences that they had in trying to get a project done on a timeline, and then the challenges they had. And for people there, no matter who they were, from a, director all the way, down, they'd had those experiences. So they were able to laugh at it in a way that meant, oh, I understand that. I've recognized that. And that's something we've all gone through. So I encourage, young professionals, but even high school and university students to attend their local conferences, and don't be afraid to talk to people about your experiences, because, we share them. And that's the really great thing about a conference is you can share, lived experiences with people that understand them.
Okay, so last point I want to talk about this little mini topic is I want to think about after the conference. What is a good after conference experience? And this is the piece that I've struggled with my entire career, from running conferences like I've done in West Virginia a lot to attending them. Is like, okay, we had this great interaction and we had this wonderful dialogue, and I've got 4,000 business cards in the bottom of my backpack, and all these wonderful things. I don't know what we do as an industry, as a people. I mean, I have to imagine this is true if you're in a conferences for Beanie Babies or whatever it may be. It's the same thing. Is that, how do you move forward with all that positive energy? Like, how do you actualize it into, I'm using a lot of buzzwords, but into something meaningful? I don't really have a good answer for this.
I don't know, but I do know that I got some nice short emails after the conference from people that said, hey, we met at the conference, and basically saying, here's the thing we talked about, here's a link to this, and then wanting to keep up the communication, or asking about, other things that can be done with the association. I'd like to say I took all those business cards and responded in similar emails, but I haven't yet, because I didn't even have business cards. It's one of those things that sort of went by the wayside, and people were asking for. So I was trying to think of, oh, that's right, we bring business cards to conferences.
Yeah. I forgot mine too. It was awful. But anyway, I think that for me, this is a free idea for any vendor, because I think vendors do this better than anybody, because obviously at the end of the day, they have to, get customers, and they have to make money, and they have to have a business, that's making money. That's their point. They're very good at saying, okay, how do we turn this into something like projects and interactions and functions and all that sort of stuff like that? And I would love to see a vendor who does this well, your Esri's or your Woolports or whoever it may be, to come along and say, well, this is how you actually do this a bit afterwards. This is how what stage 2 of a conference, the post-conference, should look like, and give us all a little bit of an education about how do you move that for all of us, governmental people that don't necessarily think in terms of, now I got to make another contact and I got to start making another client reach out and all that sort of stuff. How do we go about doing that in a positive, functional way? Yeah. So anyway, that would be, I think, a great topic for somebody to talk about. Well, that's all we have to talk about today on the conferencing stuff. Conferences are wonderful events that you should attend. And it's a great place to network. It's a great place to learn about what's going on. It's a wonderful thing that everyone should engage in my opinion. If you have any ideas for any events that you'd like us to put on the events corner, please reach out to us you can reach us at contacts@veryspatial.com. I think that's the website you hit, but you should check out these events.
So the 2024 EO for Africa Symposium is taking place September 23rd through 26th in Frascati, Italy. There is a call for abstracts that's open.
And if you're in Portland, Maine, October 7th through the 10th, there's a current call for abstracts for this. It's the URISA GIS-Pro 2024 conference. URISA's GIS-Pro conference is really good. I very much enjoy that one. That is something that if you have the opportunity to hit it up, you should. I've gotten the order of this out of it. See, we're thrown off without Jesse and Sue, so hopefully they get back from Japan soon to help us do this. If you'd like to reach us individually,
I can be reached at barb@veryspatial.com.
You can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com. You can reach Sue at sue@veryspatial.com. And Jesse is available at kindaspatial.com. And as I mentioned earlier, because I said it out of order, you can find all of our contact information at contacts@veryspatial.com. As always,
we're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
In the highs and in the lows, mountain tops and seas below, I know we'll always find a way home. City lights that burn so bright, starry nights and countrysides we'll find. All we need in this life. No matter where we go, at the end of every road, as the world goes by, we'll be side by side and we'll let the sunset glow carry us home. Every road we wander on, black of night to gold of dawn, we'll see all that we could be. When the journey's come and gone, and we found where we belong, we'll know that it carried us home. No matter where we go, at the end of every road, as the world goes by, we'll be side by side and we'll let the sunset glow carry us home. No matter where we go, at the end of every road, as the world goes by, we'll be side by side and we'll let the sunset glow carry us home.